All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everybody. Chris Neidl here. Pleased to welcome you to the latest episode of This Is CDR. I'm one of Open Air's co-founders, and this is a program of Open Air. I think we'll have people joining who've probably attended many past episodes of This Is CDR. I think we're up to about episode 110 right now. But for those of you who are not familiar with it, This Is CDR is mostly a weekly program held here on Tuesday since its inception that really works to, as the title sort of suggests, introduce our audience, whether you're new to the subject of CDR or a real enthusiast immersed in it already, to start introducing you to some of the people and ideas and concepts that are really defining CDR in very real ways in real time. And so those are startups and policy people and scientists and other subject experts. And today we're really excited to have Alexis Dunand from our good friends at CarbonGap, and we're going to be talking about their policy tracker tool, which was just recently rebooted and reintroduced. And then we're going to have a really good discussion about some of the key sort of salient developments that are happening right now or on the horizon for CDR policy in Europe. But before we get to that, I'll go ahead and give you a little bit of just a bit of overview again on the program. I mentioned already that, Open Air, this is in kind of the flagship Open Air webinar that we do on a weekly basis. I've been doing it for the last 3 years. Open Air, for those of you who don't know, is a all-volunteer network of CDR advocates, folks that in different ways are working to advance CDR at the local, state, national, and global level. We work a lot on in different domains, which I've defined it here. From the beginning, we've been very much had activism at our core, and we work on a lot of different pieces of particularly state and municipal legislation here in the US, but also to a certain degree in Europe. In a couple of weeks, you'll hear at the end, I'm going to do a survey. This is CDR about the different pieces of state legislation related to CDR that folks can learn about and join campaigns for. A lot of educational activities that we do, including This is CDR. We have a really interesting and fun and vital R&D sort of wing of our community that works on citizen science projects and open maker projects, which will be featured on This is CDR as we get into the spring. And then we also, in different ways, support existing CDR enterprises through volunteerism or co-develop concepts or business models related to CDR as a group. If you want to find out more about that and talk to some of the folks within our community and see what we're up to, do consider joining our Discord, which is the somewhat Slack-like platform that our community hangs out on and talks through. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pull up my partner in crime, Tank, who is going to go ahead and introduce our guest for today.
Thank you, Chris. Hi, everyone. Tank here. I'm a Open Air volunteer based in Taiwan today. We're very excited to have Alexis joining us. Alexis Dunand is an associate policy lead at CarbonGap, where he focuses on expanding the policy tracker's coverage. He joined CarbonGap to contribute to the fight against climate change, being convinced that carbon dioxide removal constitutes a key yet missing and often misunderstood element of climate policy. Prior to joining CarbonGap, Alexis was acting as a civil servant at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, EPFL. He previously served as a research consultant at Carbon Future, focusing on EU and US CDR policy. Before that, he was part of the leadership team of Illuminant, heading the content creation section. He started his CDR journey during his master's in environmental sciences. Having written his master's thesis on Swiss CDR policy, he holds a BA in international relations from the University of Geneva. Now based in Brussels, he is a member of the Global Shapers community. So Alexis, very excited to have you here. Thanks for coming.
Hey, Alexi, you might be on mute there. Oh, okay. Well, hang tight for 1 second here.
Okay, sorry, my mouse just disappeared from my screen, which is a bit awful.
All right.
All right. Yeah. Well,
You should
good
be able to
morning.
go out to full screen version there, Alexi.
Yeah.
That works great.
Let me do that. Right. Is it all good?
Not quite yet. If you go to, I'm not familiar with that. I think on the bottom, who's familiar with that? Right now, it's showing your the thumbnails on the side and the platform on top. So
Let's try something else.
all right, yeah, 1 sec.
Did this work?
Yep, there you go. Looks great.
All right, great.
right.
Okay, so now we can start. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, first of all. And yeah, I'm excited to talk to you about our European CDR policy tracker. But just for a small introduction about CarbonGap, for those of you who are not familiar with us, so we are Europe's leading environmental advocate focused on CDR, and most specifically on CDR policy. And our mission is to shape and enable policies that maximize Europe's contribution to the rapid and responsible global scale-up of CDR. And just for a bit of context, we were founded in 2021. We are entirely independent and philanthropically funded. We focus exclusively on CDR, and we concentrate on policy, making the link between science and then policy. We act as the intermediary between these two fields. So yeah, just for a bit of context behind the policy tracker, and then I will go through what it is, what we added new, and then a little overview of what we will do next with it. But just to present it to you a bit, we have quite an extensive team here at CarbonGap working on the tracker. I'm the one leading it, but I have been helped by many of my great colleagues here. But what's important to mention as well is that the tracker is really, the ambition is really to be a community-driven tool. It's, of course, here to serve this CDR ecosystem, but we also rely on the CDR ecosystem itself to fill the content. We've partnered with a lot of knowledge partners around Europe to make sure that our insights are as accurate as possible. So we get that on-the-ground perspective as well. And of course, it has been funded by Breakthrough Energy, so we always thank them for this. Now, just as a little refresher for those of you who are not familiar with what the European CDR policy tracker is. So as Chris said, we launched the version 2.0 2 weeks ago. But just to give you an overview of what 1.0 covers, and you can still find this on the website. So basically, if we just look at it from a European perspective, we have policies that are happening at the European Union level, and then at the member state level or the country level. So we have covered about 27 policies at the European level and in the international level that are relevant to CDR. These could be very famous ones, such as the EU ETS or the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, and also some more adjacent or nascent CDR policies. European policies that could be related to CDR in the future, like the Common Agricultural Policy and things like this. We have covered also what happens in 31 European countries. So it's all European Union member states, and then Iceland, UK, Switzerland, and Norway. And there you can find an overview of what these countries are doing in terms of CDR policy at large. And we have an overview of the role of CDR in climate policy, relevant legal frameworks that relate to CDR, then what these countries have done in terms of supporting CDR research and innovation, and then a little overview of what's coming next. And finally, we also did a very nice collaboration with the World Resources Institute to compare what Europe and the US are doing on 6 different topics of CDR policy, such as government procurement, deployment incentives, and certification and MRV. And all of this is available on our website. It's a free website because we are not for profit. So yeah, the goal is to really just be as useful as possible to you. Now, I will go to the most exciting part of this call, which is to present Policy Tracker 2.0. And basically, alongside revamping the whole website and adding some new functionalities, we added 2 main new interfaces. The first one is a funding tracker. that tracks public funding opportunities for CDR at the European level. And the second one is a framework to assess CDR policy progress across European countries. I'll go through each of them in just now. So basically, on the public funding tracker, you can find a database that tracks basically public funding. These opportunities are both what happened in the past. So for example, the Netherlands has supported CDR in 2023. You can find the exact funding opportunity that the Netherlands had done in the past on the website. There are different filters which are dynamic, so you can stack them together. And the goal of this database is really just both to provide some statistics in the past and then a forward-looking overview of what's open right now. So for example, if you are a CDR startup looking to get funding from a European country or the European Union, if you go on this database, you can find all the open funding opportunities that relate to you. And then you can add filters, etc., to find them. So yeah, for this database right now, we can find more than 620 funding opportunities that were either directly or indirectly related to CDR. So it's quite extensive, and we've been really exhaustive in mapping everything. As a disclaimer, it's not directly related to CDR, the 620 of them. We have differentiated between direct and indirect funding opportunities. Direct being, as the name can probably tell, direct funding for CDR methods, like supporting DAX specifically. And indirect is more adjacent funding opportunities for CDR that might have an impact on CDR development, but that is not directly related to CDR. This could be CCS, CO2 infrastructure, MRV, and other things like this. And right now, there are 30 funding opportunities that are open across the EU and non-countries, and we plan to cover all European countries in the future. We have also, as I said, we are able to draw statistics from it, and here is an example of the graphics that we can do. We are quite flexible in terms of graphs that we can make. So if you have also any specific requests that could be useful to you, you can always just send me an email and I can try to give you the answers. This is just an example of direct funding for CDR divided by geography. And as you can see, Denmark and Sweden have provided more than 90% of direct funding for CDR, which is quite telling. And this is this is due to the fact that both Denmark and Sweden have set aside a lot of money for deployment incentives for CDR. So this inflates the number. And then we have the EU, the UK, and all the other countries that have contributed less than 10% of its total number. And yeah, I can go into more details later if that's interesting for you. Otherwise, I will just move to the next point, which is to introduce the CDR Policy Progress Tracker. And just to give some background, in February last year, we released a vision for CDR strategy for Europe, where we introduced 7 key pillars of CDR policy that the European Union should care about. So basically what we did for the CDR Progress Tracker was to use this framework and transform it to apply to countries. So we kept the 7 big indicators or 7 pillars, which were to set targets for CDR, to clarify the rules of the game, as we call it, to develop physical infrastructure for CDR, to support research, development, and innovation, to introduce dedicated deployment incentives, secure an enduring policy framework. This is more in the context of compliance regimes and potential ETS integration, and then finally to ensure just governance and deployment. And with these 8 pillars, we then broke them down into further sub-pillars. I will show you an example right after of how that looks like. But this is basically, our ambition is really to provide a comprehensive picture of both what countries are doing internally. So if we look just at Denmark and how it's doing currently, we can see that it's on track on 2 dimensions, but on the others, there's still work to do. And then we also created this framework to be able to compare across countries. So for example, if we just look at support, research, development, innovation, we can see that between Denmark, Finland, and France, Denmark is clearly leading here. Finland is more or less there, and France has a lot of work to do still. And for now, we applied this framework to 9 countries, which we have identified either as the biggest EU economies or leaders in CDR policy. And these were Denmark, Finland, France, the UK, Switzerland, Germany, Poland, and Italy. So you can already find this analysis on the website, and we plan to cover more in the future as well. As I said, this is just an overview of how the sub-indicators work as well. So if we just look at setting targets as the main indicator, we then have 5 sub-indicators under setting targets, which we see as essential to meet towards having a comprehensive target infrastructure for CDR. And these were to have a climate neutrality target, intermediate targets between now and the climate neutrality date, separate targets for emission reductions and removals. Then within removal targets, we want to see a durable and non-durable CDR target, and then finally a net negative target. Of course, this is just to set targets, and then for all the other indicators or pillars, we have other sub-indicators. And if you press expand on each sub-indicator, you have a full explanation of why we basically graded it as such. There are also hyperlinks to all the relevant policies, legislations, and websites that are relevant to this specific sub-indicator. And then just to give you an overview of what we discovered with this framework, as a general overview, CDR policy is advancing in Europe, but there are, of course, key gaps that remain. If we just look at the state of play right now, we do see a growth of CDR, of dedicated CDR policies. We also see a growth of CDR strategies that are being developed. And we also see that certain countries might lead on one specific aspect, such as setting targets or setting rules, and other countries are less advanced in all other indicators, but are more advanced in creating a strong physical infrastructure, such as Poland, which was quite interesting because on most indicators, it's lagging behind, but on creating a physical infrastructure for CDR, it's actually not doing that bad. So it's interesting also to see these contrasts like this. In terms of bright spots, the indicators that were the most green were to have climate neutrality targets and then intermediate targets. And this is mostly due to the fact that at the European Union level, we have a climate neutrality target for the whole of the EU, and that trickles down to member states as well. Another bright spot was the regulation and permitting of CO2 storage among EU countries. This is also due to the fact that we have main EU policy related to this, which has been implemented by member states as well. And then finally, we do see quite some progress on research development spending, and then on land-based deployment incentives or non-durable deployment incentives. And then if we just look at what needs to improve, there were some aspects on setting safeguards against mitigation deterrence, separate targets, and then the use of a like-for-like principle, which is to compensate any fossil emissions with durable CDR. These principles have not been implemented by many countries yet. And the separate targets for emission and reductions and removals, we see it as one of the key things to focus on. So it's really one of the things that when we speak to the EU or to countries, we really focus on this aspect of it. Then other things to improve, deployment incentives for durable CDR. As I said, Denmark and Sweden have done already quite some progress on that, but other countries should follow as well. The UK and Switzerland have both some interesting things in terms of this, but all the other European countries are kind of lagging behind in that regards. And then across all countries, just governance is really the lowest performing pillar, and most specifically enhancing public participation in decision-making, and then sharing the burden of transitioning towards a net neutral economy. And just to give you an idea of how this distributes over countries, on the website, we have the option to make heat maps as such. You can select any of the 8 indicators, and then it gives you It basically highlights the countries that we have covered as such. Just to give an example, this is related to developing a dedicated CDR strategy. And for now, we can see that only Switzerland has done so, even though some countries like Germany are actually developing one as we speak. And some other countries like Denmark might have developed one one strategy for one CDR method, like biochar in the case of Denmark, but nothing related to CDR as a whole. Or the UK has a very clear CCUS vision that also talks about CDR, but it doesn't really treat CDR as its own specific thing, which we also want to see. So yeah, I will just briefly also mention what looking forward you can expect, and then I have some questions for you as well, just to know where to focus our efforts on primarily. So in terms of next steps, we will continue to map funding opportunities in the remaining European countries. Right now, we are working on Norway, Belgium, and Portugal, and we keep working on the other European countries as we go. So you can go regularly on the website, and there will be new funding opportunities mapped there. And then we will also continue to assess policy progress in more countries, which is also one of my questions to you, which would be which countries you would be most interested in. Right up on the list, I have Norway and the Netherlands, for example, and Spain. But I would be curious to know which ones would be more relevant to the audience. And then, of course, we will continue tracking existing EU policies that we have. Right now, in the EU, it's a time where there is a new European Commission and new initiatives that are being announced, like the Clean Industrial Deal. So we will also expand the coverage to other policies as they are being announced. For example, the Clean Industrial Deal has been announced by the Commission last week, and I've already worked on a draft to publish on the website, so you have all the next steps related to CDR there in one place. And yeah, in terms of questions that we can take after, I would be curious to know which countries you would like to see next on the Policy Progress Tracker. If you are familiar with the tracker currently, which feature you found most useful, and then in the future, what other feature could be useful to you? I'm also already thinking about the 3.0 version, so also just to kind of do a scan of a room in that sense. So yeah, that's it for me for now. And now I'm very excited to open the floor to discussions as well.
Excellent. Thank you, Alexi. Alexi, I don't know, in terms of those questions, if you want people to potentially even give you direct comment on that. Brian has already said he would love to know more about Spain, which we can get into some of the specific companies. Good question, Brian. I share your interest. I don't know if you want to put your email in there, whatever the best way for people to engage with you. If you want that kind of feedback. That was great. And what I want to just make clear to the audience here is, I've known Alexi now for a couple of years. I think even a few years when you were doing your graduate work on Switzerland and CDR, and you are one of the wonkiest of the wonks when it comes to CDR policy. You're not just the janitor who's keeping the tracker clean. You know your stuff. And so I wanted to take this as an opportunity as to really kind of pick your brain and look at this as sort of an ask me anything, at least in terms of what you're seeing around major currents and specific bright spots for CDR policy in Europe. I encourage folks to just ask questions in the tracker, or rather in the comment section. We'll pull it right in. But let me start with a couple of things here that I think are kind of most interesting for me. Is you've talked about we have a big American audience, but we also have people from all over the place. Is just to if you could kind of characterize at a relatively high level what the main foundations of EU climate policy are, or even economic development policy that CDR either sits on top of or within, or has to align with, or that's shaping the specific approach to CDR. And I think that would be useful to know, because on the other side of the Atlantic, we have, kind of a different approach, one that's highly uncertain, obviously, for reasons we'll talk about. But yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to give a go at that. Like, what's the landscape that CDR has to play within from a policy perspective in Europe?
Sure, thank you. I think that's a great question, and yeah, it's definitely one that we also covered in the EU-US comparison quite a bit. But yeah, You mentioned regulatory certainty. I think this is one of the biggest, let's say, advantages of EU policy. The reverse of this card is that everything takes quite some time to put in place, and we do have a very extensive bureaucracy to basically come up with anything new. But yeah, I'm happy to take it on a few different aspects. So basically, at the EU level itself, we have the European Climate Law, which is the main infrastructure around any climate target that we need to achieve at the European Union level. And as I said, this European Climate Law is then distributed to member states across two main legislation: the effort sharing regulation, which covers sectors like transport, buildings, mostly these two, and then waste incineration. And basically what this regulation does is to distribute the effort to countries based on their GDP per capita, their ability to pay, their emissions, and it tries to, as the name mentions, to share the effort. And this is related to these specific sectors, so buildings, transport, waste incineration, and agriculture, actually, which is a very big one that I forgot to mention. We then have
Alexis, what was that?
Yeah.
What did you say you forgot to mention? Sorry, I didn't hear that.
Agriculture.
Oh, yeah, okay, of course.
So this is one key pillar. The second key pillar is the LULUCF regulation, which stands for land use change, and forestry regulation. This regulation sets targets to member states, which basically each member state has a specific target to meet under the LULUCF regulation. And there is also a target at the European Union level to reach 310 megatons of net removals under the LULUCF sector by 2030. And then this is broken down into member states.
In LULUCF, you want to just quickly define that?
It's land use change, and forestry. So basically any activity, any emission that pertain to the land sector. So forestry, soil absorption, like soil sequestration would be under LULUCF, for example. So this is the second key pillar. And then the third key pillar is the EU ETS directive, so emission trading system. And this is not broken down by country, but more broken down by, basically at the European level, there's a certain amount of emissions that can be bought every year. And this amount of emission decreases every year to reach zero by 2039 or 2040. The main question there is how to reach zero emissions, because of course it will not be possible. And just for context, the EU ETS covers mainly industry and power generation. So the big debate that's happening right now at the European Union level is how to make this happen. And of course, CDR is very important because it's one of the key mechanisms to enable it to go to net zero. And this is one of the main debate that is currently happening at the European Union level. By 2026, the European Commission, so the European government, if we can call it this way, needs to basically release a report on their view on how CDR should be integrated or not into the EU ETS. There are also discussions as to whether there should be a separate system just for removals that could somehow interact with the EU ETS, but not directly linking the two. So I would say right now, the EU ETS is the main topic of discussion when it comes to CDR in the long term. Then in the short term, we have a few different mechanisms, which actually we can find on the policy tracker as well. There are a ton of different funding programs for CDR that, I mean, not for CDR, for climate policy or for innovation in general, which are somehow relevant to CDR. And we're also going to publish a paper, by the way, on really this specific topic, so RD&I funding in Europe. I think it's coming out this week, maybe, but I'm not exactly sure. And there we go into even more depth as to explain where CDR could fit within the existing EU funding infrastructure, etc. And then right now, the main new thing at the European Union level is the Clean Industrial Deal, which is the successor of the EU Green Deal, which was launched in 2019. So yeah, already 6 years ago. And basically, there, the goal is to really promote EU competitiveness alongside reaching its climate goals. And there, CDR is expected to play a role as well. And this is also where we are currently acting on. So basically, right now, as I said, the main topic of discussion is the EU ETS integration, but there might be other policies at the European Union level that support CDR. Potentially some sort of purchasing by the EU, but this is still very early stage and we don't have much detail yet. But they did mention some sort of public-private purchasing of CDR throughout different events. And there might be an option that is already currently in the EU ETS directive that opens the door. It's really not something clear yet, but it opens the door to have some sort of carbon contract for difference or carbon management in general, under which CDR could potentially fit as well.
So that's an interesting thing, because there's a lot to kind of unpack there and that you can help us with. And then we'll get into some of the really great questions that are already coming that are related to some of the things I wanted to raise already. So one is the dynamics between member states and the initiatives that they take, and then just taking the EU, so obviously excluding the non-EU states. And then there's a framework that is really being developed at the EU level, and particularly if there's conversations about CDR ultimately being within the emissions trading scheme. Do you think we're going to see a variety of different ways in which member states comply, whether it's through procurement or contracts for difference or something else? Or is the more it gets pulled into the gravitational pull of the ETS or sort of structurally integrated with that, you're going to start to see a convergence on the way in which member states support CDR? Like, again, this is a crystal ball type of question, but you're give a good answer probably.
Yeah. So basically, the way we see it is that ETS integration will be, if it does happen, it will be relevant not before the 2030s, early 2030s. So in any case, even in this happens to be the next big thing, we need still to cover the gap between now and then. And it's also the crucial period for many CDR startups of the next few years, how to get there and how to survive. So in any case, even if CDR is integrated into the ETS, member states will need to plug in the hole between the two. I think also just in general, if we could take a step back from CDR and just look at industrial competitiveness and these big themes that the European Commission is focusing on, the main message that we got from the Clean Industrial Deal is that the EU can provide the framework, but member states need to chip in with funding as well as the private sector. So in any case, we need member states, we need the private sector, and the European Commission only has so much resources. So we do need to paint a full picture of this. We have some requests for the European Commission and for the European Union, but now we also act more and more on the member state level to make sure that it's not only the EU, it's also member states, and then we can use leader countries or pioneer countries to really push the European Commission to make sure that we get there. So yeah, and these can include like Denmark. We are also gonna focus more on the Nordics in general in the next few years. So that includes Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, and Iceland. We see that as a potential hotspot for ambitious and leading climate policies, and especially CDR. But we also starting to focus more on Germany. If we don't have Germany in the EU, it's very hard to get anywhere. And we also have efforts in France. So yeah, basically we need everything, but the EU can provide the framework.
That's great. There's a couple of big themes I want to kind of get in on, and they're kind of coming up through the questions that folks are asking naturally. So I was going to throw just this one on just as a sort of a background to the question I'm about to ask from Brian, where he talks about Denmark. But I just want to ask a question, however dumb it sounds, is what's up with the Nordics? I mean, there's a clear pattern of leadership there. And what's interesting about it as a region, it's not as though they all got together and came up with a common Nordic plan. It seems like each of those states is for different reasons and in different ways. Like, Iceland obviously really leveraging the extraordinary potential it has, for clean DAC and things like that in order to the first facilities. You have Denmark has just been way out in front of this.
Yeah.
Finland with the first net, negative commitment. And in Sweden with a form of contract for differences around BECS or whatever. Can you just tell us a little about like what's in the water in the Nordics there? Why are we seeing such strong leadership from that CDR?
Yeah, so I think historically the Nordics have always been leaders or pioneers in climate policy in general. So I think this is kind of a natural continuation of this. As you said, for different reasons, Nordic countries are also very interested into CDR because either they have very ambitious net neutrality goals like Finland by 2035, or in the case of Denmark, we kind of had the message that they see some emission reductions as too expensive, so they basically use CDR as a cost-efficient way to reach climate neutrality by 2045 right now. And they do have this ambition to go net negative, which has not been in law yet. But yeah, I also see this comment that they feel a strong sense of obligation to address climate. This is most likely true. In general, highly developed countries like also Switzerland do have these considerations around ethical issues and then historical responsibility, etc. But I think it's really just also if in general, I think they do see CDR as a potential economic opportunity as well in the future. And they are slightly quicker to act than big powerhouses like France or Germany. They also have a slightly less painful political process at home. In France, it's very hard to get anywhere because every 5 years, there's a huge shift in the political directions. In Germany, these big coalitions are always very hard to get together. So yeah.
Cry me a river, France. I'll tell you what it's like to have cash for political changes. But yeah, that's
and yeah.
One of the things there. Talk a little bit about Switzerland too, because that's an area that you have a lot of expertise in. Obviously, not part of the EU, but like they've been doing interesting stuff on this for quite a while in a bipartisan way. So what's going on with Switzerland?
Yeah. And just to add one small thing on the Nordics, they do also have a lot of history in collaborating between each other. We haven't seen that concretely in CDR yet, but it's also one of the things that we are working on to really facilitate policy transfer between these countries and to make sure that the Nordics is really a CDR powerhouse in Europe. And for that, we have many ideas and many plans that are currently underway. But yeah, for Switzerland, I think one of the most interesting things that came out of Switzerland in the last few months or years is basically we have voted a new climate law last year or 2 years ago. And as part of this, we had another additional legislation that basically puts it in practice. And there, the Swiss government has included something very interesting, which is recommendations on the path towards 2050, by which every Swiss company is mandated by law to reach net neutrality, which is, I think, also quite a world-first initiative.
Very much.
And within this new climate law, there is a fund that's available to support the transition towards net neutrality. And to be able to get funding from this fund, every company needs to produce a roadmap that shows how it plans from now until 2050 to reach climate neutrality. And they have produced some very concrete recommendations on how emissions reductions should take place between now and 2050 with intermediaries in 2030, 2040, 2050. And alongside that, they have also produced a ramp up, like a recommendation on how CDR should ramp up within these roadmaps. So I think this is very interesting in the sense also if we just look at what's happening with SBTI and other global developments. Switzerland already has provided some sort of recommendations which are non-binding, but on how CDR should scale up between now and 2050. So I think, yeah, this would be the main thing. And of course, they have also this very comprehensive CDR strategy roadmap, which really produces a comprehensive overview of the current situation and what's the goal in 2050 and how to get there, basically.
Yeah, and I would say Switzerland, with its obviously a very sophisticated actor in the finance side, just like Luxembourg too, which is a key part of the value chain in CDR that really needs a lot of work from a policy and regulatory perspective. So it would be interesting to see what role those states, in Europe that have that is, the sort of the center of their economy can help resolve some of the issues we have around how do you commodify CDR? How do you trade it? How do you track it? So that'll be interesting to see. I know Tank has some good questions, but I wanted to just real quickly stick with our sort of jumping around hot takes on different places. And Brian did ask about Spain. And if you want to expand that a little bit, just Iberia, Southern Europe in general, very different resources from the Nordics and different economic conditions. What are you sort of seeing there? I know Portugal was an early, I think, sort of, they mentioned CDR at least in a formal way early.
Yeah, so in the case of Portugal, they have a legally binding target to reduce emissions by at least 90% by 2050 compared to 1990. So there is sort of an implicit CDR target of maximum 10% of emissions, because in the climate law, it says net neutrality is reached by reducing emissions and then compensating the rest with removals, basically. So yeah, this is an interesting case. In terms of policy themselves, we haven't seen much coming out of the Iberian region, unfortunately. But we do see a lot of potential in terms of physical resources, for example. So actually, one other project that we have at CarbonGap is called the Country Readiness Assessment, where we kind of take a reverse approach. And the first question is, what would be the potential for CDR methods within each country in Europe? We started with France and Norway, and we look there at the physical capacities, the renewable energy production, for example, now and expected in 2050. And with these numbers, we kind of estimate, according to different scenarios, how much of each CDR method each country could do. And Spain is on the list for the next batch of country readiness assessment reports. So by then, I can also have more insights on what they're doing. But in terms of policy itself, in Spain, we haven't seen much. And from what I remember when I did the analysis a few years ago, they are not necessarily too keen on technological CDR at the moment. But they also do acknowledge the fact that their natural sinks are fading, basically, due to droughts, due to fires, and many other things. So yeah, I think it's the natural continuation and the natural next steps, but policymakers in Spain haven't really made that switch yet.
And there's the different ways to approach this. Like Spain might not want to look at, oh, well, here's this other obligation we have to do for obvious reasons. But if you look at the problems they have and the resources you have, then that might be the kind of place you say, well, biochar, and you're focusing on things that co-beneficially might address some of the very problems that they're having, and it's a way that they can do CDR. So, but Tank, let's get in. You had some questions as well, and I don't know if there's also one on the audience list that you want to pull up too.
Yeah, well, I do have a question. I think this one's more for the both of you, and it comes back to fundings. So you were saying there are indirect fundings and there are direct fundings, and I was wondering, there are indirect funding just as good as direct fundings. In some cases, especially if we're trying to build up the supply. And Chris, want your take on what do you see in America as well?
Yeah, who knows what's going on in America right now? But go ahead, Alexis, take it from your side first.
Yeah, sure. So I do agree with you that indirect funding is always welcome, for sure. I think at least in Europe, we do have a structural problem with that, where CDR, at least at the European Union level, is almost consistently merged with CCS, for example. And that basically creates a sort of unfair competition between CCS and CDR technologies, because one of the main criteria that the European Union uses is the cost by ton of CO2, either abated or removed. So that does put CDR at a slight disadvantage compared to CCS, for example. So there we do see a problem with the fact that direct funding for CDR is not really there yet. So in that sense, yeah, it's kind of a nuanced answer that I would give, let's say. Welcome, but of course, we need direct funding for CDR.
Yeah, and I think in the US, and I don't know, it's not exactly comparable at the moment, but we already had a lot of corporate private sector leadership in this, which we hope would sort of imprint itself on policy. And the outlook on that at the federal level is obviously quite bleak for the time being. But I think, as we've seen in the United States before, and I'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks on This Is CDR on state policy, is that we often see in the collapse or the vacuum of federal leadership that states and municipalities really pop up in a big way. And over the long course of time, that can interestingly keep moving things directionally in the right way. So things are very much in churn and uncertain at the moment to make any kind of definitive predictions on that. A general question, you would flag this, Tank, too, that I think it's worth, this is really about a kind of compliance about, you set up rules, from Andre, just about, how enforceable are these commitments? What's the penalty or pain, to make sure that whatever commitments come up are actually going to be, delivered on?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Basically, the official answer is that there are penalties for countries if they do not meet their climate targets. It's legally binding targets, so yeah, and it's directly applicable to member states. So they do need to reach the effort sharing regulation target, which is, just to remind you, transport, buildings, and agriculture, and waste incineration. And then the LULUCF target, so the land-based removals target, let's say, and also land-based emissions. So on these two aspects, there are binding targets, and there are punishments, or like fines if member states do not comply with them. This is the official scenario. But then in practice, the EU is still made up of member states. And if member states all together jointly do not meet these targets, there won't be any punishment because member states are mostly behind the decisions themselves. So, for example, if we see that Germany, France, Italy, and Poland are not reaching the 2030 climate targets, in practice, there is not much that the EU can do to still enforce it. But then it gets into more geopolitical discussions as to how supranational entities can enforce regulations, and this is a bit more complicated. But yeah, in theory, there are strong punishments. In practice, it depends how member states comply to them, basically. And that gets a bit trickier.
Yeah, we'll end with a really important kind of elephant in the room, sort of geopolitical question, particularly between the U.S. and Europe in a second. But Tank, I'm going to pull up John's question because I think it does link quite nicely with a sort of a broader point. So if you wanted to read that one, if you can see it, Alexis.
Yeah, sure.
So John is asking initiatives that are executed by EU companies that are, deployed in non-EU countries. How does that qualify for, fundings or even for some of the classification and database?
Yeah. Just to add a finer point on that too, is I think that is really interesting about how Europe or other places are looking at, where you're trying to build an industry locally, and that's part of the argument. But if you're ultimately going to be directly funding projects, you want to have as big of a pool of projects and to be able to at least have the options of ones that come at the least cost. So I just wanted to add that dynamic to it in terms of where you see other outside of Europe or within Europe being eligible for project funding.
Sure. So yeah, to reply to the first question, basically right now we look at public funding opportunities that are basically financed by countries. So we do not really look at what are the recipients, we look at the source of funding. And in this case, we looked at the European Union and then countries within Europe. So for now, we don't necessarily look at where that funding is based or where the project is effectively done. We might in the future expand the database to globally, but that would depend also on collaborations with other organizations, etc. And one thing that we might do in the future as well is to cover private funding opportunities. And there, I think it would also make sense to look at the global landscape, but it's also, basically if we have capacity and collaboration opportunities, we are happy to do it, but on our own, we cannot really cover that at the moment. And then on the second question from you, Chris, I think if we just look at what's happening at the EU level, in the nationally determined contribution to the UNFCCC, so the NDC of the European Union, the EU basically rules out using any Article 6 credits, basically, I just put it in common language. So that means that the EU needs to meet its climate goals by itself. And by itself currently means by activities that are produced within the European Union. In the future, that might change because of two reasons. The first one is that the EU is currently reassessing whether to open its NDC to Article 6 credits.
Yeah.
And this is mostly due to the fact that it lobbied quite strongly within the UN to make sure that the standards are high. And if the standards meet the EU standards, I think they would be quite open to just open the door to Article 6 credits. It's still not sure, but we've heard some things going in that direction. And then the second thing specifically to CDR is that the CRCF, so the Carbon Removal Certification Framework, has a revision clause. So it means that it will be reopened by policymakers in 2026 to assess whether Article 6 credits could be eligible under the CRCF. And that would mean that basically CDR credits produced globally could potentially be included in the CRCF. And that means that then CDR from abroad could be accepted by the EU. But this is also early stages and it's not happening yet.
It's also, some of it is dictated by the mechanisms of support that ultimately get chosen. I've shared this with you pretty extensively. For years have been working on Luxembourg and have gotten to a very specific, pretty robust policy. And looking at that, I mean, if you're talking about CDR procurement, which is becoming a thing, then does European or national procurement law around competitiveness, and there's different geographies that have to be included just from a free and open markets perspective. It'd be interesting to see if that overrides, the climate policy. But anyway, it's very, very complicated. And I think it's about first actors putting things forward and then seeing what legally sort of flies. Let's do this here. So I do want to talk a little bit about, again, just with the proviso that there's no way that any of us really know how things are unfolding, even in the short term. But with the actions of the Trump administration, not just on climate, maybe even more significantly on defense and the strains on, the NATO alliance, and you're going to have budgets that are boosted in Europe for defense spending. You're going to have the tariffs that are going to have an impact. And that's always the concern I have, where it's refreshing to see how much Europe is very rapidly, and I think generally in a smart and comprehensive way, thinking through the integration of CDR. But there's sort of a first man in or last man in, first man out quality to this, that if you start to have real economic pressures within Europe because of these other forces, is CDR the first one that's going to really sort of take a hit on commitments that actually require real cost and investment? So again, I don't expect you to give me an answer that I can take to the bank on it, but is that a concern that you have as well, as just these other events that are happening and how they might disrupt the CDR agenda in Europe?
Yeah, indeed. I would love to have an accurate answer to this. But yeah, I can start give my take on it. So basically, how the European budget works is that every 7 years, there are huge discussions within Europe, and it's mostly between member states, to determine the budget for the next 7 years. And once that budget is accepted, it's usually sort of set in stone because it's a regulation. And there are very few instances that I know of, at least, where what had been agreed under these negotiations has been reversed. But coincidentally, these discussions are happening now for the 2028 to 2034 period. So these larger defense discussions might have an impact there, where there might be a slight shift in priorities between climate in general and then defense funding or AI funding as well, which is also a big thing. But I would say the EU remains still very committed to climate goals, and it has made it clear through the Clean Industrial Deal that climate still remains a thing and a very important thing for Europe, also in terms of competitiveness, since the US is also feeling that, kind of taking a step back from climate leadership, at least at the federal level. It's also an opportunity for Europe to take the hat again. So that's also how we try to frame it, at least in the European Union context. So personally, I'm not that concerned. It's more in general how much people care about climate, and that determines more whether CDR gets funding or not.
Yeah,
and
I
then
do.
just one other small thing. Most of the funding in the future will come from the Innovation Fund as well. And this has very much committed funding to it through the EU ETS revenues. So also, if we look at this, for example, the defense discussion will not have any impact on the Innovation Fund. And then at the country level, TBD.
Yeah, I hope what you say is that, it's not just how deeply soaked into the culture environmental and climate values are in Europe, but that they do see, this is a sort of a defining moment for really carrying the mantle and moving it forward, with or without the United States in the hopefully the short term. So we'll have to see. It's a moment, but sometimes moments like this create all kinds of surprises, and they're not always all bad. So we'll have to see what happens. And we're going to keep the light alive at the state and municipal level here in the U.S. for sure. So, well, Alexi, I want to really thank you. I mean, again, I just want to. CarbonGap is such a great organization. For those of you, I'm sure a lot of people are familiar. They just do very high quality work and then are able to render complicated things in very understandable ways. I can't tell you, Alexi, how many times I've used your last and now your new tracker just to kind of get a sense of the stuff that's going on that I can even use referentially when I'm talking about things here in the US, because that really does help to be able to show the things that are going on, not just for ideas, but for normalization. So please do take a look. I threw a couple of the pages from the tracker as we were talking around Denmark and Sweden, but there's just an enormous amount of stuff there. It's really easy to navigate and it's really, really well expressed. So keep up the great work, Alexi. We'd love to have you back anytime.
Thank you.
I know we'll be bumping into each other around other stuff that we work on together soon.
Indeed.
But yeah, really appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your week. And what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to tell you a little bit about, we got some good stuff coming up in the next couple of weeks. I'm really excited to have Mast on, Mass Reforestation on next week. My good buddy, Brady Perrin and Maria Huer. And this is, we don't do a lot of stuff on reforestation on This Is CDR, but their approach is really quite interesting. Tank dropped the Luma there. You can take a look at the company. And so really excited to have them on there to talk about their, really restorative CDR model. So definitely don't miss that. And then we have a couple other ones booked, and we also have a few other ones, but I couldn't fit them on there. But following Mass, we're going to have the open source protocol One Shot Earth. They're going to come on and talk about something very near and dear to my heart around the idea of, MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification protocols, particularly for more difficult CDR pathways, to be able to develop those in a sort of an open source way. To me, I feel, as we'll get into it in that session on the 18th, what open source is and how it relates to some of the pain points and challenges that we have for MRV, particularly for difficult to MRV pathways. So excited to have the folks on for that. And then the following week, I am going to do sort of a survey for advocates on the different state and potentially municipal CDR-related policies that are going on in the United States, which is important all the time, as I've advocated for, but in this particular moment in the U.S., leadership on the state level is absolutely critical. So Tank did drop that there. You can take a look at the Lumas. We'll get the one for the 18th and 25th hopefully up this week, but you can register for Mass Reforestation now. But I want to thank everybody for joining us today, as always, and hopefully we'll see you next week.